cities are at the driving forefront of transitions to sustainability, livability, and community resilience. My next guests are city leaders working on urban sustainability and green buildings. Lucia Athens is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Austin, Texas, a widely recognized eco-friendly city that earned a spot on the EPA's top cities list last year. And Angela Tovar is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Chicago. The city just launched its 2022 Climate Action Plan, setting a target of reducing emissions by nearly 2/3, while bringing justice to communities that have been disproportionately harmed by climate change. Welcome, Lucia and Angela.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. Lucia, I want to start with you. You're really a pioneer in this industry. You've been writing and working on urban sustainability for, over 20 years. What progress have you seen in that time? And do you think we're on the right track in some of America's most major cities to becoming more sustainable?
Well, that's a great question. I would say, the perspective of that many years working in this field, the transformation has been extremely powerful, and I definitely think we're on the right track. We didn't used to really talk very much about green buildings, and now LEED is a recognized standard, across the world now for excellence in green building. When I first started going to climate summits through the Global C40, the 40 largest cities in the world working on climate change, and Austin is an allied city, the mayors themselves were not actually able to speak that articulately about climate issues. And as we just heard, from Mayor Rhodes Conway, these mayors are very, very up to speed on these issues, and they're very bullish on getting the policy work done. So we are moving swiftly in the right direction is my perspective.
And Angela, I think you bring such a unique perspective to the table, talking about, and I'm talking about your previous roles focused on racial equality and inclusive economic growth, or inclusive positions, excuse me. How do you include that, marry that with sustainability? I think when a lot of people, hear social justice, for example, and sustainability, there's a lot of confusion as to how they're connected.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that they're very connected. And I am hopeful and thrilled to see more cities understanding that intersection. We have cities and communities within cities that have historically shouldered the burden of environmental harm. And that's not unique to Chicago. We have environmental justice communities all across the United States and globally. And, these are communities that have a higher concentration of industry, communities that have a higher concentration of pollution producing facilities. These are communities that have grappled with a public health crisis for a very long time. So as we think about the future and the goals and targets that we want to set to address climate change, we also have to recognize that there are communities that have been left behind historically. And so our work here in Chicago, and I know that this is the work of many cities that have been moving forward, are thinking about how we advance our priorities equitably, how we think about communities that have not been a part of the solutions historically, and how we make investments that drive equitable co-benefits that our communities sorely need, especially in this moment.
And Lucia, before you were in Austin, you were in Seattle, and you focused quite a bit on and led their award-winning green building program. What were some of the lessons you took from Seattle to Austin, and also what are the differences you've seen? I imagine that the way sustainability is achieved in many American cities or cities around the world looks different in each city.
Interesting question. There's a lot to talk about there. I just off the top, I would say one of the things that has been very much a similarity is both Seattle and Austin are very fast growing cities. And so trying to get in front of all that growth and leverage the growth that's coming to try to make it more green has been a key focus for me. And part of why I think we've been able to get people as excited about sustainability as I think a lot of people are, because we can actually see some of these projects coming out of the ground. And here in Austin, we have a LEED Platinum library, our downtown central library. I also worked on a library project in Seattle as well that's also was LEED certified. So I think both these cities have populations of people who are very well educated. They're very involved in local issues. In addition, both cities own their own electric utility. So, that gives resources to advance sustainability in solar programs and electric vehicle programs like the one we have here in Austin, very robust program, as well as, of course, kind of your more core things like energy efficiency. Our green building program is within our electric utility, Austin Energy, here in our city. So cities that don't own their electric utilities, that's where I think some of the biggest differences do come up because they don't have that leverage.
Right. And Lucia, going back to your past, I read that you grew up on the industrial waterfront in Lake Michigan. How did that, or I should say, Angela, excuse me, how did that influence your work in sustainability?
Sure. Yeah. This work is both not only important, and I'm glad I'm in this role and can bring my perspective to it, but this is also, very personal for me as somebody who grew up in an environmental justice community. I have seen firsthand what extractive industries can do to communities, and especially, I grew up on the South Side. When we were at the height of the steel industry, and then only for a decade later for globalization to cause the departure of that industry and to leave our community with brownfields and without a stable economy, right? And so I think what is important now is when we talk about the intersection of social and racial justice and sustainability, we're also talking about understanding what community leaders have told us for decades. They have vision for their community. Our frontline leaders, our frontline climate leaders have been talking historically for decades now about solutions to build out green economies. And we know that this is feasible. And so a lot of our work in Chicago is building partnerships with those communities to understand how we can both rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so that we can mitigate climate change, but also make important investments that drive co-benefits that our communities need to thrive.
I'm curious to hear how the recent demand for more non-renewable energy resources, such as oil, due to inflation and, of course, the war in Ukraine, are impacting cities, especially cities that are trying to be sustainable. I would imagine that, that demand and, adding on top of that inflation and such makes that difficult. Angela, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think if anything, the volatility of this market has taught us that it's time for this transition, right? This is something that we've known in the climate space for a very long time. And you heard Victoria from EDF talk about, the value of electric vehicles. We know that not every Chicagoan or many people in our city have access to electric vehicles, nor do we have the infrastructure yet to sustain that. But I think what we are learning from this moment in time is we cannot be dependent on oil and gas any longer. Not only does it not make sense from a market perspective, but also from a climate perspective. And we have options, right? We can build a robust zero emissions transportation network that meets the needs of everyone in our city, whether that be a walkable city, a bikeable city, increased transit options. Our transit authority just lowered the cost to increase ridership, which is very exciting. And then, of course, for those of us who do rely on cars, especially with cities that have fleets, electrifying that fleet.
And Lucia,
Victoria, could I chime in on that briefly?
Yes, of course, please do.
Yeah, really great comments. I agree with everything that you said, Angela. I just wanted to also add that further to those points that for cities that are investing in renewables, they're really diversifying their portfolio of assets to allow for more stability when things become very volatile, right? So in Austin, our goal is to be carbon free by 2035 for all of our electric generation. I checked today, we have a dashboard. We're at about 78% today. That's mostly solar, large scale solar, and large scale wind out in West Texas, and also some Gulf Coast wind. Those assets have performed really, really well. The big challenge now is for us to figure out more energy storage for those assets, and also with wind, the infrastructure to get that electricity to where it needs to go from where it's being generated is another big area where we need investment, and hoping to, get more of those dollars from the federal government to make it, easier to have a electric infrastructure network that is, able to tap into all the renewables. And on the mobility stuff as well, even here in Texas, where we're, a very car focused state and a culture, our voters passed a tax measure to build a massive light rail network across our city. So that really tells you things are changing and people are ready for the change.
Well, and what's that dynamic like in Texas, Lucia? Because I understand that Austin, has very clear ambitions to be very sustainable, renewable energy friendly. But at the same time, when I think of Texas, I think of it being a major, home to, major oil corporations, and there's lots of oil there. What's that dynamic like? I mean, I'm sure there's probably some tension there.
Yes, that would be an understatement, perhaps, but it's definitely a very challenging environment to be doing some of this work in. We also have, a lot of innovation happening here in the energy sector and in the tech sector, and we have Tesla here now. So, there is competition, for who's going to be in the front on all of these areas. I would say that, at the state level, the state politics are a hamper for us at times. We have to be very careful about how far we go with some of our local policies, as innovative as we want to be, because sometimes the state, and this is not unique to Texas, but sometimes the state will dampen down what we're doing at the local level. A lot of people refer to this as local preemption by state government. So across the country, over the last year or so, a little more than a year, there was a very organized lobby by the natural gas industry to pass bills that passed in many states, almost identical bills, that basically, for us, it keeps us from preventing anybody from hooking up to natural gas if there is a natural gas line. And that is an impediment to us to meet our carbon neutral goals for buildings. We want, building electrification and carbon neutrality for buildings. So there are a lot of challenges.
Yeah, and Angela, going back to Chicago, I mean, what are some of your long and short term for Chicago's sustainability office? I mean, are there some specific benchmarks you think that are important to meet?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the beginning, we just released our climate action plan, which is very exciting for us. I think that what makes this plan unique to Chicago is that we really focused on our ability as the city to drive the outcomes. And so focusing on our ability to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 62% by 2040 as our interim goal. And so those are tied to 5 pillars that also drive those important equitable benefits, community benefits that I talked about. So the plan centers on things like lowering cost of or driving utility savings and expanding access to renewable energy, prioritizing our households and our businesses. And so that would include, ensuring that we are retrofitting and decarbonizing all of our buildings in the city of Chicago, and also committing to a 90% goal of 90% of retrofitting and decarbonizing our own buildings and our own portfolio by 90% by 2035, and expanding Chicago's own community renewable energy by 20 megawatts during that same time. We want to invest in a more circular system. So Chicago has a traditional blue cart, black cart system now. And we know that we have the opportunity to divert materials for our wet waste from our waste stream, and to put things back into a system of reduce, repair, and reuse. And we have a goal of diverting our waste by 90% by 2040 in that plan. I talked about our prioritization of a zero emissions transportation network already, something that plan highlights as well. And then, of course, much like Lucia, we as the city want to invest in our clean energy future too. We know that is critical. Chicago already has a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2025 for our own municipal load, and 2035 for the city as a whole. And those are goals that we're on target to hitting. So we're very excited about our progress there, and as something that we upheld in that in our climate action plan, and also underscored our commitments to things like energy storage, and also just energy reduction, so reduction in consumption as well.
And we'll be watching for the progress made in Austin and Chicago on this front. Thanks again to Lucia Athens, Austin's Chief Sustainability Officer, and Angela Tovar, Chief Sustainability Officer for Chicago. Great to be with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.